Tonight is different because we now have this voluminous report. Not a summary, not spin, but the majority of Mueller's findings in this partially redacted document. This has far more evidence and details than the theater that began today, which Brian and I were just discussing, that pre-report press conference with Bill Barr offering his views of the report under what can only be described, and many experts described it this way today, under a suspicious format, where Mr. Barr insisted on offering his opinions before Congress or the public had seen a page. And we have now learned that while Barr kept that report from Congress, feeding those suspicions, he did manage to provide an early copy to the White House and to Donald Trump's lawyers. That's providing a copy to someone who's the subject of the report before others see it. Now, here's what we know. Mueller writes in this report that he chose to detail facts on obstruction evidence against Donald Trump rather than declare a legal conclusion because, you may have heard about this, because the Justice Department prohibits prosecutors from charging a sitting president. That alone tells us one big thing you can remember tonight. Attorney General Barr was incorrect and was misleading you when he claimed that this report we now have simply failed to reach a conclusion, and thus that Barr had to step in and decide one. The news tonight on that big central claim of what we're even reporting on, what we even got from Mueller, the news tonight is it was the opposite. Let me show you. Bob Mueller writing that the rules mean neither he nor Barr can declare that Trump committed obstruction because, quote, no charges can be brought against a president. Not because, as Barr had claimed, that Mueller was allegedly leaving it to the Attorney General to determine if the president committed a crime. That's Mueller v. Barr. That's a side-by-side that is going to animate this, I think, for some time. Now, just as with the famed Watergate roadmap, Mueller suggests here that it is for Congress to decide, not the DOJ. Okay. After everything that's happened today, let's take this in pieces. What I just told you is Mueller's written, carefully considered view of why he cannot just write or yell, hey, I think the president committed obstruction. But what if a probe were to find that a president definitely did not commit obstruction? What do you do then? Well, here's the second clue that you need to know tonight as you head into a holiday weekend and everyone's talking about what this report really says. Bob Mueller writes that if a probe did find that kind of good news for a president, the authors of that probe would put the good news in the report. And they didn't. Bob Mueller writing in what we just obtained today that, quote, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. But the facts and evidence left Mueller simply unable to reach that judgment. Now, with that context in mind, with just those two facts from a report with many more, Mueller listing the damning evidence and not clearing the president, even though he says he would if it were warranted, that brings us now to what we can view in context. We had to wait 3 weeks, but we have it for you. You remember that partial sentence that Bill Barr famously plucked in his early letter, where it said that Mueller wrote that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. That sentence, we now know, comes after the fuller explanation of what Mueller was up to. And it looks worse for Donald Trump on obstruction precisely because it comes in a context of saying, if I could clear him, if that's what the evidence showed, I would clear him. And then you have the evidence laid out here that Donald Trump did try to interfere in this probe. He didn't pull it off, at least to full results that he'd hoped for, because his own staff wouldn't help him. Mueller writing the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, largely because the persons who surround the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests. You don't have to succeed at obstruction to commit obstruction of justice. There are people like Michael Flynn who told lies that didn't work. That is to say, their lies were unsuccessful and they're convicted of felonies. Now, there's also, and I want to be very clear about this, undoubtedly good news for the president in this report. Mueller's team did not establish the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Again, we knew there were no indictments. Today, we have the full report in context. And I'll tell you that quote, which matches some of what we were earlier seeing, does make sense in context. Then there's other troubling information. A second instance of Russia offering negative information about Clinton to the Trump campaign, the kind of foreign offer you're never supposed to take. This is in addition to the Trump Tower meeting And what are the details? Well, that I can't tell you, because that very, very interesting fact that you may be hearing about for the first time, a new offer of foreign help, it's completely redacted. And there are also in other sections entire pages redacted, including the bulk of the discussion of something of major interest, politically, investigative, legal, quote, Trump campaign contacts about WikiLeaks. Now, late today, Democrats insisting the redacted report is not good enough. They want the whole thing so Congress can fully assess whether and if Donald Trump committed the high crime of obstructing justice. As we were reporting here, Julia Ainsley from the Justice Department, they're offering a limited briefing to a few members of Congress. Dems saying that's not enough. They're also saying they will hold Attorney General Barr to his claim during his press conference today that Mueller himself can go ahead and testify.
Robert Mueller remains a Justice Department employee as of this moment. Will you permit him to testify publicly to Congress?
I have no objection to Bob Mueller personally testifying.
Leading off our coverage tonight, I'm joined by Maya Wiley, former councilman mayor of New York City and a former civil prosecutor in the SDNY, NYU law professor Melissa Murray, who is a clerk to Judge Sotomayor, and former federal prosecutor John Flannery. Good to see each of you. John, out of Washington, D.C., where so much news went down today, your view of what it means that we now know Mueller was outlining the evidence for consideration, not letting Barr, passing it off to Barr to make a decision.
Well, it's very interesting how he did it, I think. I think he wrapped himself around the axle, but in a way he was faithful to his by-the-book personality and character. He felt constrained by the former rulings about indicting a president, a sitting president, though he said you could collect information. But then he went on and say something else interesting, which is that if he felt that if he said that these were crimes, that would be unfair even to Mr. Trump, because he would have no way to answer as he would at a trial. So I think he decided, having locked himself into this path, that the only way to deal with it would be, as other special prosecutors have done, is to draw a pathway to the Congress. And I think that if you just take his second section, you have...
So when you say that, in your view then, if Barr had taken that first letter and submitted it to court, what would a judge make of it? I mean, how misleading was it?
Oh, no, it was totally misleading. In fact, in the report that we have from Mueller, he basically takes that June 2018 memo that got him the job, as well as his statement in the letter, the 4-page letter that misleads us as to what the report said, and he tears it apart, saying that, of course, we don't need an underlying crime to be proven in order to have obstruction. And
so by your count, how many big or important things are Mueller and Barr disagreeing about now?
The whole letter, the 4-page letter. They don't agree on anything.
So the letter is about obstruction. As you said, it's about the legal underpinnings of whether you need the underlying crime. And it seems they also disagree about who has the last word, which is kind of the whole point.
Well, that's right. If he's the independent counsel and we have a dependent attorney general who's prepared to sell his oath of office to protect Trump, who's the object of the investigation, and help him write an answer when we're preventing the public and the Congress and everybody else from knowing what was found, I think this is a guy that shouldn't be in that office, because there are ongoing cases. And now that we've seen him, it's shame on us if we don't get rid of him, that we don't seek to impeach him, that we don't ask for his removal, that there isn't a House resolution to get rid of him. Well, today was transparent. The troika of justice standing there, the 3 men, but not Mueller, who wrote the report. What kind of conduct is that for the chief law enforcement officer of the country not to have the person there? But
not Mueller. This is, as you put it, the troika. Rod Rosenstein playing another role in this chapter, Maya. He's played many roles. They were missing Bob Mueller, and that's what I want to get your view on. 23 months in, no Mueller, and this is what Barr said when asked about it.
Was he invited to join you up on the podium? Why is he not here? This is his report, obviously, that you're talking about today.
No, it's not. It's a report he did for me as the Attorney General.
Well, not exactly. So the thing about the DOJ regs is what they say is that the Attorney General makes a decision about what will become public. Once the Attorney General said, I'm going to make it all public except the grand jury material and whatever I have to remove because of ongoing investigations or what would reveal methods or private information of individuals who need to be protected lawfully. Once he said that, there is absolutely nothing in the regulations that say Bob Mueller can't get up there and talk about his report. That's not the way it works. What happened is William Barr used his position as the Attorney General to keep Bob Mueller from answering questions so that he could put his spin on the report before the rest of us saw it.
Yeah, and Melissa, this report, which is so voluminous, I mean, we've been making our way through it, but it reflects Bob Mueller's choices about what you need to know. It's long, but there are things that we know from our reporting that aren't in there. And then there are things that are in there. And I want to read some of them because they paint a portrait of this White House and this president and his efforts to shape the outcome of the investigation. Just looking at some of the highlights, you have Donald Trump finding out that Mueller's appointed, and he says, "I'm effed." You have Trump deciding, quote, Mueller has to go. You have Trump saying this whole thing is going to be, quote, the end of my presidency. You have Trump's own lawyer explaining what he won't do. He won't fire Mueller, which might get him in jail. And he says, I won't do this crazy expletive. You have Trump going back to it and saying, I need to knock out Mueller. And then you have, again, this lawyer McGahn saying, look, we're on the edge of a Saturday Night Massacre, which was part of what ended the Nixon presidency. From a legal view, why does Mueller put that stuff in there?
Well, I think one of the things that's being set up is that this is an administration that is in complete and utter disarray insofar as the rule of law is concerned. You have a president who's asking his aides to do things that they know cannot be done, that are illegal. You have a president questioning his White House counsel about the propriety of taking notes. He says he's never had a lawyer actually take notes. He's had lawyers like Roy Cohn. So this is a different kind of White House, a different kind of approach to the rule of law. And I think Maya said it best. You can see how Bill Barr has been brought into it. He is no longer the Attorney General for the entire United States. He is the defense attorney for Donald Trump, and that's an incredibly different role. And I don't know how Bill Barr gets away from this. I mean, the Department of Justice is battered after today. His reputation is battered. This is a sad, sad time for the rule of law and for the department, which has been held in high esteem by most for its long history.
I think that's very well put. So, Mr. Flannery, I want to put you on the spot for the rather wild news banner, even by the standards of 2019. Wild not because it's an expletive, but wild because the special counsel Mueller, a serious person, included this in his narrative for a reason. Quoting what he uncovered, that when President Trump found out there was a probe, his reaction was not, okay, we have to figure out how to deal with it, or we need a strategy, or should we cooperate, or gosh, how long will it take to get the facts out if I believe I'm innocent? His response was, this is, quote, the end of my presidency, I'm effed. Square both pieces for us, John. On the one hand, what does it mean when the subject of a probe has that reaction? On the other hand, why was Trump wrong? Because the report is out today, and it doesn't look like it was the end of his presidency as of tonight.
He feared a nation that would actually adhere to the law. And in that condition, he was effed, if you will. But he also was admitting the truth of the implication of an investigation that was going to find him out. And Mueller said there were basically two phases for the obstruction investigation. The first phase was dealing with Flynn leaving and trying to get Comey to kill that part of the investigation. But the second part, when he started to obstruct with Comey and others down the road and publicly and privately, that was the second part of the investigation. And those two together did a number on the president's psyche. This is a guy who's a bully, but he also plays the victim. He's a tender creature when you come back at him. It's unfortunate that more people don't take on the bully, and I think that Mueller did that in this report. Also, it tells you a lot about the state of mind of Trump, that he would slump, feel deflated, because he's facing the law that we're not following. And that's why we miss a great opportunity if we don't take this report and do two things. Deal with Barr as the head of the Department of Justice, or Department of Injustice with him there, and we do something with the report on the Judiciary Committee, and we do it soon. We don't waste time anymore. We get at it, because nothing less than the conduct of our government is at stake. And the irony of him referring to the Office of Legal Counsel memo is that we would be afraid of compromising the governance of the nation. This is exactly the opposite case. As long as this man is president, the governance of the nation is compromised.
So at the end of the day, do you think Mueller made the right calls?
No. He made a couple of calls that I would disagree with. One is agreeing with the Office of Legal Counsel. He could write a report saying there should be an indictment, and he could explain, as I just suggested, why the Office of Legal Counsel sitting inside the executive department is wrong in that policy and applying it here. Also, he should have called Trump to the grand jury.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.